I couldn't be happier to introduce Sendhil Mullainathan. He is, I didn't ask you what I should say about you. I was going to read the he's a university professor of, he is a university professor and a professor of computation and behavioral science at Chicago Booth School of Business. He's worked on machine learning, poverty, financial behavioral economics, and a wide variety of topics, including the impact of poverty on mental bandwidth, whether CEO pay is excessive, yes, using fictitious resumes to measure discrimination, showing that higher cigarette taxes make smokers happier, modeling how competition affects media bias, and a model of coarse, C-A-O-A-R-S-E, coarse thinking. His latest research focuses on using machine learning to better understand human behavior. His most recent book is Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. And he writes regularly for the New York Times. He publishes in all the top economics journals and many others. And then he also helped found, some of you have heard of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. It's a nonprofit that applies behavioral science to promote the use of randomized controlled trials and development. He was a co-founder of that. He also serves on the board of the MacArthur Foundation, has worked in the government, is affiliated with the NBER, EREAD, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You're going to tell us what EREAD is in a minute. But first, my last sentence, prior to joining Booth, Mullainathan was the Robert C. Wagner Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he taught courses about machine learning and big data. He began his academic career at MIT. And before he speaks to you about machine learning and health economics, what is BREAD?
Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development.
There you
Close?
go.
Something like that?
Great. Thank you so
Did
much.
I miss something?
That's right.
No?
Excellent.
How do you know, Supri? All right.
Please welcome me and join me in welcoming.
All right, thank you. This paper, I'll mainly present one paper, which is joint work with Yhat Obermeyer, who's here. I'll take snippets from a few other papers, which are, one of them is with Jan Spies. I'll always say he's a PhD student, but he graduated, so I suppose I can't keep saying that. But and Liran Einab and Amy Finkelstein. So let me start and dive in. I think I want to just give a big overview for about 5 minutes to contextualize the rest of what I do. And the big overview is that I think as an economist or an applied economist, an applied econometrician, I think it's actually very hard to make sense of a lot of these machine learning tools. Like if you opened up the elements of statistical learning and you look at it and go, oh, so there's a lot of stuff going on, and you look at the table of contents, and what makes it particularly hard is there's a bunch of stuff that looks like things that you already know. Like, I know what a linear regression is. Are you telling me machine learning is a linear regression? I know what a spline is. That's great. There's some things that you don't quite know, like what's a support vector machine. You dig a little deeper and go, wait, is that just a logit with another name? And then there's some stuff that's missing. It's kind of, that's literally, it worked out perfectly that there's a little hole there. Inference, hypothesis testing. So, okay, so what is it? And I think the first thing I just want to do is a very quick, about 10 minutes of giving you a sense of at least my perception of where machine learning tools fit in the econometric toolbox. That's by way of, that way we can understand, okay, we know these things, we know how to use them, this is this new tool, its comparative advantages, this and that. So let me start by just pointing out the reason for the confusion is that machine learning is an empirical tool. And if you look at a simple task like face recognition, it's basically a function estimation problem. Your input is some pixel grid, which is 0 to C and K by K, like if you have a K by K image. And your output is presence of face or not. And so that's all really. There's your input is one of these images has a face and one doesn't. And what are you doing? You're estimating a function that does well given some loss function. So I think the confusion runs quite deep. It's not simply just that you see terms like linear regression in a textbook. It's that even the most complex deep learning convolutional net, they're really just doing some form of out-of-sample expected loss minimization in some function space. So really, they're estimating functions given an x and output. So really, what is the difference? And I think you can see the difference already in some of these convolutional nets. This is obviously a schematic, but if you just did a counting exercise and said, wait, I've got k squared variables, but actually it's not k squared variables, it's ck squared, and then you've got a bunch of interactions through all of this, you'll realize effectively you're estimating tens of millions of variables with less than typically tens of millions of data points. So one big divide is people will often emphasize that these techniques are high dimensional, that they have, like in a linear context, that you have the ability to work with more variables than you have data points. A different way to think about high dimensionality, of course, is the dimensionality of the function space is much bigger than the data set. So however you want to count it, it's just estimating a lot of parameters, it looks like, with far less data, and it really ought not to be something that you do. And I think that's an intuition that is in many places. I want to argue that, for me, that intuition is just not very compelling, or at the very least not complete. And here's why. I mean, literally, it's obviously true, but if you take this to be the perspective, oh, I know a bunch of tools, they fit y with x, and they're low dimensional. This is a tool that fits y with x and is high dimensional. Great. That's just better. We've just been doing the wrong thing the whole time. In fact, why isn't everyone doing machine learning? It's just bad. There's something misleading about simply just thinking of this as high dimensional. So let's kind of understand what the difference is. The first thing I want to observe is that the task that the tools are tasked with are very different. And if we understand that the tasks are different, we'll see that their properties, in their stability and other properties will be very different. The task of prediction, like face estimation, is pick a function that predicts y. That is the loss minimization that I wrote. So does this image contain a face? Will this person default on a loan? The task of estimation, which is actually the one that's more familiar to us, seems similar but is quite distinct. At a high level, it says make inferences about parameters of the data generating process. It says assume that y and x are related through some true f star of x. Make inferences about that true f star of x. Conditional covariances are the most common example of this. Does education correlate with default conditioning on everything else I know about the person? That is a statement about the true data generating process that you would like to be able to say the conditional covariance. I think that's quite a different task. In most machine learning applications, it's not clear we care about making inferences about the underlying data generating process. It's not like in face detection we care about, is it exactly this pixel combination that's going to create a face or something correlated with it? Great, something correlated with it, what do I care? So that distinction, I think, is very, very important. And to see why it's important, I just want to walk through a very, very toy example. I'm sorry if this is too basic, but it was helpful for me to see. So the toy example is, suppose there are two variables, x and w, and you're just running a linear regression of y, or a linear estimator that relates y to x and w. So you run your regression, it outputs some parameter, there it is, of beta x and beta w. What happened? Wow, that was a big jump back. And it outputs some standard errors on this point. And so here's your standard error set. So you've got sort of confidence intervals, and suppose that when you estimated it, you have pretty wide confidence intervals. And if you try to do a hypothesis test and try to reject any one of these, you're like, oh, look, I can't really reject the null that beta w is 0. I can't reject the null that beta x is 0. And so you kind of imagine you have a confidence interval that looks like this. But this is actually quite misleading. It is not obvious that the geometry of your confidence circle looks anything like this. And in that inner geometry of how these two confidence intervals relate to each other is actually, I think, a big difference between prediction and estimation. So if this were the true geometry, you actually you could neither reject that beta x were 0, beta w were 0, and it would be hard to reject the hypothesis there's no signal for y at all. You can't predict y using x and w. But you can have this confidence intervals and not have this particular geometry, because of course, if x and w covary, then your confidence region would look like this, which has the same projection down. But notice now you can't make much inferences about the individual parameters, but you can say with a great deal of confidence that X and W predict Y. And this is at the heart of the difference between prediction and estimation. We can't make very good inferences about beta X or beta W with confidence intervals, confidence regions that look like this, but we can do a lot of good prediction. And that's because predictors do not need to adjudicate exactly the source of the signal. They're happy if a few variables covary with a few other variables and together they seem to constitute the same kind of signal. Great, I'm getting predictive power. I don't care. But covariances of this type are very problematic if you want to make any sort of parameter inferences. And that is, I think, going to be very problematic. So let me show you an example of how this plays out in practice. Here all we did is a very simple prediction exercise. Just took the American Housing Survey and we predicted house prices using a bunch of variables. Now there are about 90,000 data points and we have about 142 variables. Of course, high dimensionality here comes from the fact that there aren't many variables, but there's going to be a ton of interactions that could potentially come into play. And here's the exercise. So the exercise is, oh, well, how well do we do at predicting house prices? It turns out that if you look at sort of an ensemble predictor, it does modestly better to much better, depending on how you look at it, in predicting house prices. So in the middle of the distribution of house value, it's about 16 to 15% better. At the tails, it's 4 to 7% bigger. So that's somewhat, that's not important. I'm talking about house prices today. What I want to do is to think about if you had made this estimate and you'd done this, from a prediction point of view, you assess predictive accuracy. The temptation is to say, oh, well, let's look and see what the predictor is doing. What are the variables on which it's getting the signal? So suppose I'd done a lasso. It's very tempting to go in and say, I did a lasso. And which variables were selected by lasso. In fact, almost everybody does that. So let's do that. So let's suppose that what we did was we say, oh, look, I formed a little, this is my attempt to be a biologist. It looks like one of those DNA strips. A black indicates that it's non-zero, and a white indicates a variable 0. I put all the possible variables here, and you can see some variables are chosen. And like, you say, you might look at it and say, look, number of bathrooms is chosen. That turns out to seem to be important. You might have inferred and looked at another one and said, oh, interestingly, actually, number of half bedrooms doesn't matter. Half bathrooms doesn't matter. Oh, okay, that's interesting. And that, I think, is exactly at the heart of prediction versus estimation. If you take seriously what I said before, these choices are somewhat arbitrary. They don't really have much meaning. And one way you can see that is you can see that by saying, suppose I just reran this exercise. And in fact, as you can see, because I already put folds of the sample here, we've kind of split the data into 9, and this is what we got on one part of it. And then we just redid the exact exercise on each of the other folds. And what you find is, there's like it's like you're literally reading tea leaves. This is not a problem of lasso. This is lasso doing what it was intended to do. It's a problem of our interpretation of lasso. The same variable, of course, has no reason to be selected. If you made some very strong assumptions about the data generating process, and we can talk about that offline, you get some stability of selection. But absent those very strong assumptions, lasso is giving you prediction guarantees. And the predictive quality is quite constant across these folds. It's doing exactly what you'd expect. Doing what it was intended. The exact variables to use. Now, why is this happening? It's inherent to the nature of high dimensionality. In my stupid beta X, beta W example, you're like, oh, well, then they covaried. What's the big deal? But once you're in a world of hundreds of thousands of potential right-hand side variables, of course there's going to be a lot of covariance. And you certainly cannot have any intuitions and make restrictions on all of those covariances. So that, did you? All right.
Just wondering if you're not sure how to question it, but just wondering if you're trying to persuade me that machine learning has little, for what economists currently do. That is, maybe I've cooked my brain this fall by reading too much Judeo Girl, but I was kind of thinking that one goes out there, one gets the entire set of correlations, and then one puts some model-based or directed graph-based causal structure on it, and then one argues back and forth about how does the great covariance matrix in the sky constrain what you then are able to conclude given whatever assumptions you make about the causal graph. you're saying we're never going to get there because machine learning is never going to present us with the covariance matrix for variables, for the variables that we need, precisely because of its high dimensionality, both problems and use cases.
Yeah, I love covariance matrix in the sky. That's pretty good. But I think, let me not say it as strongly as I'm coming off here. Let me say that close to what you're saying, which is in order to properly identify we're not going to identify the full covariance matrix, of course, I mean, if you knew what it was, but in order to properly identify and get model selection out of these things to know that you picked the right variables, there's a huge set of auxiliary assumptions you need. Those auxiliary assumptions I can characterize. Bin Yu, who's here, has a beautiful theorem on identifiability of lasso and has done a lot of work on lasso per se. And the most important assumption she makes in her things, and she's sort of tried to expand on it, is an irrepresentability condition. So most people in this lasso case would say, well, maybe the assumption I need is the true model is sparse. That's not anywhere near enough. Why? Because a bunch of false variables could correlate with the true variables and you'd be back in trouble. What you really need is a very, very huge set of conditions that tell you none of the true variables are representable by the other variables that are not true variables. And that is basically quadratically increasing the number of assumptions you have to make. So as with all statistical tools, if you're willing to make those assumptions, if you're sure about that, then sure. But I think as an empirical person, I go into these techniques because there's so much variables on the right-hand side. I don't feel like I was willing to make assumptions about the data generating process. These tools seem to give me really good ability to make predictions without being forced to make such assumptions. And I think exactly as you're saying.
And so your prediction device might well output that in this sample, race is a better proxy for permanent income than your very noisy other.
Right, and it may output. And it would output in a different draw of the same data some other variable. It's just getting signal where it can. And so I think, to get to your point, I think of the parameter inference world we lived in as making a bunch of data generating process assumptions and getting out parameters. Here I'm allowing for flexible functional forms and getting predictions. I used to have this low dimensionality restriction. By moving to this world, I'm moving to a high dimensional world, but I have to accept that I'm not going to be able to adjudicate between observably similar functions in the data, of which there are going to be an enormous number of them. So as an economist, I think of myself as I used to spend time on beta hats. To really use these tools properly, I would want to spend time on Y hat problems. And I think that's to your question, is I'm laying all this out forward because I'm trying to sort of say that one good way, at least in my opinion, of trying to apply these tools is to change the kind of problems that we tend to look for, that I think we ought to be looking for Y-hat problems. And micro Y-hat problems are not the kind of problems that we've been trained to look for. And I think the biggest change of these tools will be to help us look for new problems. So that's kind of why I went through this whole part. I'll talk through three kinds, and I'm going to focus on the third. The first kind, which a lot of people in this room do, and it's kind of, I think, one of the big avenues forward in social science, is that the Y-hat problems are incidental. Ultimately, we're going to do beta hat questions, but the data that we're going to use is going to be processed using Y-hat-like things. So language data, image data. Josh has great work where you take cell phone data and you use that to get a poverty predictor. And now that's a Y-hat problem. But now that poverty predictor could be an outcome in an experiment, because now you're converting one data set to another data set. So there's a lot of amazing work to be done there. The other kind of awesome work that lots of people are doing now is to use prediction in the innards of causal analysis, not just of experiments, of other things. Probably the easiest one I can explain to you on this is that instrumental variables inherently has a Y-hat problem in it. If you instrument for X, you can see you're doing something there, which is you don't really care, and often you have a set of instruments and you'd like to use something like a machine learning algorithm to convert that. But there's a very nice strand of literature. I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to talk about the fact that let's go straight into it and ask, what are situations where Y-hat as an object in some social science, economics type setting is inherently useful? And by inherently useful, I want to talk about things where we're going to be able to use it to actually understand the phenomena better. not simply use it. I'll give some examples later, but not simply use it to say, oh, we're going to improve decision making. I actually want to argue that Yhat by itself can be an enormously useful input for generating understanding about systems. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. So any questions about this, and then I can keep going? OK, perfect. So let me start on the context in which I want to do this. The context I want to do this is healthcare. So a very common fact about health economics that all of us kind of know is that there's a bunch of low-value care. In fact, that's probably the modal thing every person in the US knows about the US health system. We do a lot of treatment and testing that is not very useful, and we shouldn't be doing it. So a lot of healthcare spending is wasted. Today I'm going to focus on testing. There are a lot of tests that we just shouldn't be doing. They're expensive, and they're wasted. And these are the kind of things that you'd see 1/3 of health spending is spent on things that don't make people any healthier. And then in case that didn't resonate, here it is in dollar figures. Overtreated, there are even books with these titles. And you'll just see this everywhere. So these are like the kind of arguments that you've seen everywhere. So that's the fact I want to kind of think about in this context. And to do that, I want to take a specific example. Suppose you walk into a hospital. Well, let's hope you don't do that. Suppose someone walks into a hospital, into an emergency room, and complains of any of these type of symptoms. They say, oh, I've got some chest pain, some shortness of breath. The doctor, at that point, has to make a decision. Should I test this person for a heart attack? Now, what makes it a complex decision is that, on the one hand, there are good reasons to test for a recent heart attack if you just had one. And the reason is there's sort of scar tissue that's just formed. If we can get in and resolve that scar tissue right there, there are huge treatment benefits that are well known. So if we can find out if you just had a heart attack, we could act and treat and do something about it. It's very effective. On the other hand, it is expensive and hard to diagnose whether you've had a heart attack. You might say, oh, well, chest pain, that must be a sign. As Yhat says, the chest is very close to the, is that right, the abdomen, Yhat? So abdominal pain and chest pain are very close to each other. So you might be having a heart attack, or you might have just eaten Indian food. And there are probably long-term sequelae of Indian food, but that's probably not what the doctor wants to address. And so we would need to resort to some fairly expensive testing, stress tests, actual catheterization of the person to see if we can see something. So who should the doctor test? In fact, when we say wasteful testing, what we mean is that the doctor is testing a bunch of people they ought not to test. So what is the doctor's decision? Well, here I want to just observe who to test is exactly a prediction problem. It's not a beta hat problem. It is exactly a Yhat problem. Because if we test and find nothing, that's a wasted test. If we test and find something, that's a useful test. So we want to test those who we will find something on. So all you have to do is to say, if this is the health of the person with the test, this is the health without, the entire gain of this testing treatment is proportional to whether the test was positive times the treatment effective intervention. So if you want to ask, should I test or not, the expected value given the person's observable is just a term that's monotonic in the positive test rate, plus this extra term, which I'm going to assume away as 0, but you should see what that is. There are people that you might not want to test who have a very positive test yield rate, but for whom the treatment wouldn't be efficacious. We know what those are. Very old people who, even if we saw they were having a heart attack, we couldn't stent them. So we're going to assume that away and move them away from the population. And the key is we're left with this fairly simple formula that the benefits of testing are strictly proportional to the probability of finding a test, of finding a positive test. So as a result, I just want to point out that all of this literature, do doctors overtest, is equivalent to, are there predictably low yield tests? Which is exactly, you estimate expectation of the test yield given the x's and ask what fraction is below that threshold. So in effect, this basic question in health economics is really a Yhat question. And so that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and get at that in a Yhat way. And the prediction strategy we're going to use is we're going to predict the yield of testing for heart attack. And we're going to look at those people who are tested urgently in the days after the ED visit. So they come in, something's shortly thereafter they're tested, and who gets an intervention as a result. So if you imagine there's a test, you could imagine looking at the result of the test, but really the ultimate way of knowing whether the test was positive is, did it lead to some action by the doctor that was an intervention? Okay, so it's just as an aside, it's worth pointing out that you could say, why didn't you just predict heart attack? That's because there is no data in the data. There's nothing that says heart attack. I'm going to come back to this later. This is one of probably the biggest misnomers in this field, is there's a lot of sort of heuristic use of variable labels. It's not as if this data holds these type of semantic variables. They really are just things like diagnoses and interventions, et cetera. Even when you look at RCTs, you end up having to do this enormous adjudication process by a panel to even get a variable like heart attack. Okay, so the interesting thing is the intervention summarizes an important chain of events because it goes test to interpretation to intervention, and it's extremely well measured because that's what you're paid for. So now I'm going to just take every patient who walks in. So let me tell you what the data looks like. So every patient who walks in, we know a bunch of things about them. We know their demographics, their diagnosed conditions, everything that happened prior to them walking through that door. We also have, in principle, stuff that happened to them in the ED. What was their chief complaint? What did they say to the doctor? What was their appearance? These I'm not going to use. I'm not going to use these because, and this is going to be important, one of the key is we want to make sure that we are doing a fair test and using information only available prior to the actual test. And this is the point at which you have to get very nitty-gritty, but a lot of these things, it's not obvious that they were coded before the test. Some of them are coded in the notes which are written after the test. So you have the chance to predict very well, but you're not predicting, you're just letting a lot of information leak. So we're going to focus simply on the top part of the data. That means our predictions are going to be not nearly as good as if we had had all the data the doctor had at the time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this with Medicare claims. For a little part of it, I'm going to also use data from a big hospital that it'll be impossible for you to figure out which it was, because it's not like you could know where Yhat practiced medicine. So these are the features we have at the time. We have, over the last 3 years, a ton of things that are available to us, the ones I've already described. And we observe, going forward, the tests and the outcomes. So I'm going to predict the things here using everything here, and sort of an ensemble model using OLS and gradient boosted trees does extremely well. In case you're interested, it does, at this level, it does do noticeably better than a simple logit with the same data. It put some numbers here. In the riskiest 1%, for example, the two models only agree about 40% of the time, and the machine learning model manages to find twice the yield in the riskiest 1%. So the machine learning algorithms here, I won't go into this detail, but do prove to be actually quite helpful, and are very helpful. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to, with that in place, I want to just understand, so what did we find? So here's the testing versus the algorithm predicted risk. I want to start by observing, okay, so this is the relationship. Predicted risk put into 20 bins over here, realized intervention over here. The first thing I want to observe is, how is it that in this literature we tend to think about over-testing? We have several ways of doing it, but one of the most reliable ways we have of doing it is to look at average yield. So it's kind of like you're saying, I wanted to know, are we testing too much, in the margin? Well, I have the average yield. And you can do that here too. Look, there's the average yield. It's about $120,000 per year. This is awesome. About $120,000 per year, and that's what we might use. But this is a very weak test because you actually have the entire distribution. Why are you using the average? Suppose the average yield were very, very high. That doesn't mean there's a bunch of people that aren't over-tested. And you can see that in this data because even though the average is at 120,000, The bottom is much worse, and the top is actually quite good. And that's even just the top thirds. You could start to strip away and go further and further down. So the average yield is quite a bad way of doing it, because here this is screening smokers for lung cancer, and this is cancer immunotherapy. And you're finding quite a big difference in distribution of yield. The average yield is also a weird way of doing it because it doesn't quite tell you the extent of the problem. The average can be below what you think is the right level at which you should be testing people. But it doesn't tell you how many fewer people we ought to be testing. Should we be testing nobody? No one should get tested for heart attack? What the population? And here you can see there's actually quite a bit of good tests and quite a bit of bad tests. Okay, so what I want to now do is to say, okay, that to me was helpful because it helped me go back to something that I kind of felt like I knew, which is low average yields, but look at it using these Yhat tools to really understand the marginal yield distribution. But implicit in this figure is something that is kind of weird, which I want to walk you through. So take these riskiest 5%. They are incredibly cost effective. We should be testing those people. So that's good, no problem. But there is a problem here, which is 88% of those people are untested. So we were worried about the low average yield, and we were worried about the yield on the left-hand side and looking at all the people there and thinking maybe we should zero out, this population. And that's the gist of this entire field, is over-testing. And there's been some recent work that started to go and talk about, wait, what about these untested patients? There's a little bit of under-testing evidence from the literature, and here you start to see it very clearly. You start to see, wow, maybe all these people should be tested. And I think when you start thinking in those terms, it also illustrates something. One reason I think that while these tools are helpful, I think they really do belong in an econometrics toolbox, because by themselves they can be very, very misleading. I argued that, oh wow, there's so much under-testing. How would I know that? 88% were untested. I have no idea what would have happened had they been tested. I only know that the algorithm called them as high risk. What does that mean? I know that in the tested, people who look like that has a positive test. I also know that these people were untested. And we have a big selective labels problem. We know the outcome of testing only when the person is tested. We don't know the other way around. We don't know the outcome of testing when the person is not tested. We know it when the person is tested. I just want to point out that I think right now, if I were to look at the literature, I think most people deal with this problem by assuming it away. And that might be your temptation as well, which is to say, oh, well, let's just impute values for the untested set. Let's assume that the same outcome would have happened conditional on the x's. Let's find people like them. And I think that this is a very, very, very strong assumption. And I think this is the assumption that probably is the fork in the road where a lot of the econometrics work that we've been used to starts. And if you don't make this assumption, so let me walk you through why it's such a strong assumption. It's assuming that there's only selection on observables. Let me just walk you through what that means. That means once I know all the x's, knowing whether the doctor tested or not has no additional information for the patient's risk. A different way of saying this is not just that the doctor has no additional useful information, it's that the doctor is flipping a coin. Well, if you're assuming the doctor is flipping a coin, then of course the algorithm's always going to do better. You just assumed away any possible advantage for the doctor. And let me skip this sample data. Let me just walk you through something else. You already know that the doctor has information potentially that we don't have. Remember, I couldn't use all this. The doctor can. And in fact, in our data, with the Medicare data, we don't have a lot of this. But in the hospital data, we have things that typically don't make it into a lot of these machine learning algorithms, and they could, and they're starting to. So let's do a synthetic exercise where we take one thing, the ECG, which is very important for heart activity, and in the hospital, we actually have access to that data, and in the Medicare claims, we didn't. So we could ask, how did our ECG-free predictions do relative to data that happened to have ECGs? And so you can build a model, you can make sense of these ECGs, you can fit them, and that's fine. You can all imagine how that does. And what you tend to find is that this is the predicted risk, and these are various features. Let me walk you through. In the highest risk population, there's much more ST elevation, which is one of the signs that you would expect to see. So the ECGs of the high risk tested appear to look very different than the ECGs of the high risk untested, which is kind of what you expect. Your algorithm didn't have some information, and the doctor did. And we can go through this and see other things. Normal ECG is lower, and the yield of testing looks very different in the highest risk bins once you account for some of the ECG information. Of course, the ECG is only some of it. The doctor gets to talk to the patient. The doctor gets to see and do physical examinations. And so you can see the problem is this was an unobservable in the Medicare data, but it's one that would have led us to falsely conclude that there's undertesting in that sample. Okay. And there are many more variables like this. So this is just by way of saying one of the big hurdles that you encounter in a lot of these projects is this sort of selective label problem. And it's probably, I think, the biggest impediment, more than do we get beta hats or not, to actually applying these tools, because in many problems, the data is going to be generated by a human decision process. My favorite example of this is hiring. People will say, I have an algorithm that identifies good employees. And if you think about that for a minute, you realize, how could you possibly know that? Because you actually don't know anything about the people who weren't hired. How could you even know whether this algorithm does a better job than the human? It's just not possible without some totally different approach. Oh, I actually went and randomly hired people I wouldn't have. That seems like the headline. And this happens in a lot of things. And so I'm flagging this because I think that in the machine learning literature, this is probably the biggest unaddressed flaw to date outside of using something like selection on observables, which I think, as economists, we would find that, at the very least, an assumption that needs to be defended very heavily before just throwing it around. Okay, so we sort of have two solutions I want to talk about in our data, because I do think the undertesting is an interesting possibility. So the nice thing here is we don't have labels on testing because they weren't tested. But because it's a panel data, you get to follow these people over time. You get to see what happens when they're sent home. So even if you can't figure out the outcome of the test, you get to look and see when they were sent home, were they fine or did something happen? And it appears that while there is some unobservables that this high-risk pool isn't all just high-risk people, it does have some very high-risk untested people. So this is the untested population followed up over the next year, and in this case it's 180 days, to see what happens. And you'll see that in the very high-risk population, about 22% of them go on to have a positive troponin test, which means that they had a heart attack. 8% of them go on to have a very big heart attack, and about 2% of them go on to have a very, very, very big heart attack. It's not just heart attacks. You start to see things like cardiac arrest, urgent procedures, death. The high-risk population is much more likely to have the kind of consequences that we think follow from having an untreated heart attack. Yeah. I see. So yeah, here I'm not making an argument that this is a good predictor of these outcomes. I think here I'm thinking of it as, that's a great question. I'm not thinking of this as, oh wow, we have a good predictor of what's going to happen. I'm thinking of it as, I had a bunch of people, I thought they were high risk, but they were sent home untested. So the doctor made a decision not to test these people. I would have thought they're high risk. Now we just need some way of scoring that disagreement. And I think what I'm saying is, since we don't have the tests, let's score it using their realized outcomes on some other variable. I'm sure this is not the best predictor or even a great predictor of these particular outcomes. That if we were going to do a mortality predictor, we could come up with a much better mortality predictor. But this is more of a way to get a label on the disagreement set. Does that make sense? Yeah, mortality is one. This is a good example. The top 5% die at about twice the rate, cardiac arrest, about 4 times the base rate. Okay, so that, let me go here. That's the first place that I want to kind of talk a little bit about the solution to the selective labels problem is just by trying to get other labels, which in the medical context we're able to do. In other contexts, it's quite hard. It's unclear how you would do this in judicial decisions where the judge doesn't release somebody. They don't have other labels. They're in jail. They don't really produce anything else. Okay. There's a second kind of tool which is much closer to the econometrics toolbox, which is this almost feels like with all the unobservables floating around, it almost feels like you want an experiment. It's not quite an experiment, but close. What you'd love is a bunch of people to just be tested at random in ways completely unrelated to their actual risk. So in effect, it's kind of begging for the kind of causal inference tricks that we've kind of created over the last few decades for other purposes. To see the effect of blank, let's find arbitrary variation. Here, let's find some arbitrary variation to find places where there are more and less labels. So one such thing that kind of turns out to be pretty good is that there's quite a bit of variation in testing by the day of the week on which you show up. If you show up on Monday through Tuesday, here's the days to the test, you kind of get, that much testing. It kind of aggregates up. If you show up on Friday, you'll see you get a lot less testing. There's kind of an intuitive reason for this, which is, and on Saturday you get even less testing as well. And the reason for this, you can kind of go through here, Sunday, people on Friday, Saturday get significantly less testing at every risk decile than people on Monday through Thursday. And the reason is Sunday through Thursday. And the reason is, if you come in on Friday in most of these hospitals, to do a test, I'm going to have to keep you overnight all the way till the following Monday. So it's actually just a much bigger ask to keep you there. So you say, okay, I just won't test as much. And that's in fact what you see. It's kind of a bit arbitrary. You can look and see whether the X's are balanced, and they're pretty balanced across these cases. So it gives you a kind of little bit of exogenous variation to play with. And so you see about 4.2% versus 5%. So how can we use this exogenous variation? I think the way we can use it is to ask the question, first, we see a drop in testing. Does this reflect private information? Is the marginal person who's tested because it's a weekday, is that person higher risk given their observables? So one way you can do that is you can compute the average yield at each of these bins for these two groups. And given the averages and the difference in rates, you can back out who was the marginal patient, or not who was, but what was the yield of the marginal patient. And what you see is that the two averages line up right on top of each other. You'll see there are 3 lines here. There's the Friday, Saturday, the Sunday through Thursday, and then you have the marginal tests. And they basically very tightly line up on top of each other. Which means that there's a bunch of people who look just like their observables would lead you to expect, but that are not being tested on the weekend, but would be tested during the week. That by itself doesn't seem problematic, except for the fact that if you look at where they're coming from, doctors are drawing the marginal patients from across the risk distribution. So you can see that it's pretty arbitrary which part of the distribution the marginal patients come from. If you're going to cut back on the weekend, you should cut back here. Now, you can think of this as over or under testing. Here's a way to see it as under testing. On the weekend, there are all of these patients that should have been tested that were sent home that had very high yields. And so that's the second clue that we have, is when you look at the exogenous variation in the low testing regimes, there's a bunch of high-risk people who are going untested, which is kind of the calibration of the testing. So the bottom line I kind of want to take away is there are many untested high-yield patients. We're not just over-testing, but we're also under-testing. And I want to point out that it's hard to bound the extent of under-testing because it's going to depend on the amount of variation that we can get. The more variation we can get, the more tight the bounds are. Okay, here's why I think this is important, because I think that first, we're so used to focus on the overuse case, I think there's relative neglect of the underuse case. But more importantly, I think the levers we use depend on our implicit model. If you think of the common view, the economic model of this very often, it looks something like there's some distribution of risk, and we test people who are above that threshold. So you set a threshold, and you test people above it. Doctors set too low a threshold, and everyone in this little region is being over-tested. That's kind of a sort of a funny, a ridiculously simplified view of this. And we often gloss over a very important part of this model, which is what you've seen, which is that if everything is focused and rank ordered like this, we should simply disincentivize testing. We should encourage doctors to raise the threshold. So, for example, if we have a bunch of high testing hospitals, we should make them like the low testing hospitals. In the economic model, that's a great idea. You should just move this threshold over here and we'll be better off. But if doctors are also totally misranking, then moving the barrier from here to here, it's not clear what you're doing. Yes, you're reducing testing, but you're reducing both under and over testing. And the consequences of that can be pretty high, because now you have a bunch of untested high-risk patients. And so one way you can see this is, let's go back to the between hospital region variation, which we often use in healthcare. Here are the high testing hospitals. Here's the low testing hospitals that we would like the high testing hospitals to emulate. This is the testing rate by predicted risk. This is not a good sign, because you could be happy that, wow, look at all of this low-risk testing that we're dropping. Or you could say, what the hell, they're dropping even more the high-risk testing. And in many ways, you're almost throwing out the sort of the baby with the bathwater when you sort of just generically raise this. If you just look at average yield, it will look as if, wow, we dropped a lot of testing, didn't do much to our average. Why? Because you're literally dropping from everywhere. It is not a particularly smart drop. Okay, so that's why I think this is kind of interesting. Let me move now to kind of try to make sense of what might be happening. What are the kind of errors that are leading to missorting? And here I just want to do a purely speculative exercise. We are not, I don't think we've got a great crisp way of analyzing these problems, but I just want to try using some of the same predictive tools for trying to uncover sources of error. So this is more of a speculative exercise, and realistically, it's something that's going to generate hypotheses more than it is going to be a testing of some behavioral model. So to do that, the first thing I want to observe is there's actually something kind of very nice in a graph like this, which should tell you something about physician decision making. It's awesome that the curve goes up, because it means physicians are actually sorting by predicted risk to a degree, which I think is great. At least there's some signal. But of course, there's some component of risk that they're neglecting or overweighting, because that would be needed for us to understand why it is that when they decide to test less, they prioritize some of these people. What do these people have that makes them risky that they're neglecting? So it's as if they're taking some component of the y-hat of risk, but neglecting the other component of y-hat of risk. So to make sense of it, I'm going to show you a set of sort of graphs that try to do something with it. All we've done here is take y-hat and take the testing decision. Simply run OLS on a bunch of right-hand side variables and ask for each variable what is its coefficient in this OLS regression for predicting risk, and what is its coefficient for predicting the test decision. And you just scatter the coefficients against each other. In a way, this looks like an awesome fact about the doctor. Look how this is like a nice line. It's very related. They're getting so many of the coefficients right. And if you just name them, they look kind of interesting. things, diseases of the heart, hypertension, these have high risk over here, high impact on testing. This one's kind of interesting, diseases of the circulatory system, where you're like, you would have thought that's kind of should lead to more testing. But of course, you have to remember, this is conditioning on diseases of the heart. So they're even getting the category part right. It's kind of cool that doctors are getting all this right. But there's a problem here, which is there are about 1,000 variables or more here. And these are the bold signals. And there's a lot of mass here. A ton of variables are accounting for a ton of signal other than these, but they're all relatively small coefficients. So looking at it at this level of aperture, it's almost misleading. Not misleading, it's reasonable, but it's missing part of the story. And you can almost squint and see it. Like, this looks super flat. And in fact, if you kind of zoom in to the 80% of the variables that are sitting there, you actually see a very flat line. There's just no relationship. So they're getting the bold signals, at least that's a hypothesis, but all the signal that's locked in little by little in all these other variables, they don't seem to be getting at all. So you kind of see this here. So based on this data, we wanted to understand, so how could we actually show this? And so one way to dig on this hypothesis a little more is actually to do a variation of this graph. So where is this? So this is something you're all familiar with, which is kind of like a tuning graph. We just built a decision tree model, to be simple, of risk. And we're asking, how much of the big Yhat model that we have does a decision tree of depth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 explain? And you can see that at some point, it's get diminishing returns. At about 17, it looks like it's not explaining that much more of the risk. So you've all done tuning graphs like this, and it'll start to go back down if you keep going further because you're overfit. So this is for explaining risk. Now you take the exact same model. So this, at 5, is a decision tree model of risk that's very shallow. It's kind of it's over-regularized. There's a lot more signal that it's not picking up, but it's picking up the first 5 levels of depth. So then what we can do is to say, don't retrain anything. Take literally that model and ask how well does that predict the testing decision. And much like you saw in the first graph, wow, you go up at about 6, it just peaks. There's just no more signal for testing. But we know there's a ton more signal for yield still sitting past 6. So that's a sense in which you can almost think of human beings as possessing, I think it looks like, or at least doctors, who I think are human beings, as possessing some sort of model which is excessively regularized and almost too simple of a model of risk. Okay, so let me stop there and conclude on that part of the paper and just sort of conclude and say, here are the kind of lessons I take away. First, I think this exercise taught me the importance of sort of doing Yhat exercises. I think if I'm honest with myself, I don't know if machine learning was central. Would I have gotten all of this by just doing logits? Maybe. Not nearly as much spread and not as much power. But the center here was to start thinking of this as a pure prediction problem, I think. And then after that, yes, use whatever tools you can to predict. The second lesson I take away is that if all we were doing was predicting yield in the test decision, this paper would have taken almost no time to write. It's just a mechanical application of machine learning on a claims data set. Almost all of the work goes to actually a bunch of these econometric economics issues that arise because of the selective labels problem. And to me, that, I think, is probably the most value add that economists can have for this field as much as they can benefit from this field. And I think I at least learned a lot because it changed how I understand this arena, and it was not simply a look, we can put out a decision aid. I've kind of understood some structural problem a little better. And I think there are other applications like this. I think testing is just a special case. I'll skip these, but prediction has quite a bit broader uses. I'll tell you, should I stop or should I have 5 minutes? I'll do one last to show you how extreme a different paper could look like. This is a very different kind of paper using a Yhat problem on the health system. this is with Liran and Amy and Ziad. And this starts with an observation that in health, if I asked what's the second fact most people know about healthcare, they would say we spend all the money on people who are about to die. Most of our waste comes because 25% of our spending are on the 5% of people who are about to die. And we replicated this in the claims data. It's not quite 25% in that data, but you can fiddle with it depending on. There's this funny thing that you have to deal with, which is this is the group that died about 5% that year. You have to decide what would the spending on them had been had they continued to live for the next 11 months, 10 months, 9 months. So there's a little bit of fiddle. I won't worry about that. But you can get something like 22, 15, 22%. So in fact, yes, we spend a lot, as many people have documented, on the people who are about to die. Okay. And the implied narrative in this literature is very clear. Look, we're about to spend money on the people who are about to die. That's just wasted resources because they died anyway. It's like replacing the engine on a car that, conks out fully a month later. That's about as callous a statement as I could probably make. And once we make this distinction, healthcare spending is a total waste. And the implied narrative is an efficient system would avoid this waste and could save up to 25% of spending with no mortality implications, because after all, you're spending it on people who died. So I'm not saying this. This is like lots of people have said this. There's a problem with this narrative, which is, I hope is obvious the way I'm saying it. We're spending on those who end up dying. That's not the same as spending on people who are sure to die. For example, it's clear that, what is the thing Amy says? It's clear that the most ski accidents happen on the last ski run. I don't know why most is there. I don't know who these people are who go back out, but I guess if you ski, you have other things that you're doing. And the implicit assumption here is the people who end up dying are the people who are sure to die. It has an assumption that death is very, very, very predictable, and that the population who died are disproportionately coming from the highly predictable population. There's embedded in here a statement about the distribution of predictable mortality, a distribution of Yhats. Kind of an obvious point, but it's an obvious point that somehow is missed in the literature. So now we kind of actually went and predicted mortality using claims data and a lot of claims data. And what you find is death really isn't that predictable. So even if you look at populations where you're like, wow, you really are sure it's people who are 85 years old let's see, where's a good one? So there's 80 people who are over 85. Only 8% of people have predicted around here have predicted mortality greater than 50%. Almost all of the deaths in the 85 plus are coming from people who are not having a predicted mortality above 0.5, and that's in a very small subset of the population. So when you read sentences like this, like Atul Gawande has a great quote, "For most people, death comes only after a long medical struggle with an incurable condition. In all such cases, death is certain, but the timing isn't, so everyone struggles with this uncertainty with how and when to accept that the battle is lost." Certainly in our data, it doesn't appear to be that there are many people at all for whom it's very clear the battle is lost. Now, if you play this forward and actually look at the concentration of spending, this is the share of total individuals with p hat greater than a particular value. So let's go over here. You can see there's very few people with p hat greater than 2/3. Very, very few people with p hat greater than 0.5. And if you look at the concentration of spending in this population, you can see that by the time you get out to over here, greater than 0.25, actually roughly half of your spending there is going to someone who survived. So it's very hard to say, oh, that was wasted spending, because a lot of it went to people who actually lived. Maybe that's a causal effect of the spending. Now, you could say this is just because we have a crappy predictor. And I don't have time, but we can talk through why that doesn't seem to be the case, that it really is that spending is not that concentrated. And that a big fraction of the sort of widely popularized number is really just mechanical, that those who are sick tend to die. And in fact, a big fraction of the spending on the dead comes from people who had very low predicted mortality. They're just people who are sick, and we spent money on them, and sick people die, and that's it. Okay, so let me just conclude, because that's a different Yhat problem, and just say, I think the credible identification revolution, to me, is very influential in my career, and I really learned a lot from those causal inference techniques. I think the thing that I really, when I reflect on it, learned the most is it wasn't just a new tool for answering old questions. It really forced us to ask a whole set of questions that we would never have asked absent credible inference strategies. Even the question of like, does a program work, which we now do a lot of experimental evaluations on, was not at the center of a lot of academic research until we got this tool. And I think there's a similar future for machine learning in economics. I think it's to the extent that when you think about it as, oh, it's not so useful for answering these questions that I care about, maybe, but it's definitely going to be useful for answering a whole set of other questions that we really ought to care about. And I think that might be a good framework for thinking about it. And let me stop there and take questions. Thank you.
This does not amplify. It only ensures that this gets recorded. So, questions? Comments?
Hi, thank you. First, thank you so much for coming. My question is really around the white hat problems that excite you. You know, there's healthcare. I hear a lot of criminal justice, which is something that excites me. Is there something else that we should be thinking about? You know?
Yeah, I think that in social policy, there's just an incredible number of such problems. And in fact, an easy formula for finding them is to think of any particular social policy problem that you're addressing with causal inference and actually think about what's happening there. And there's usually a Yhat problem that's neglected. Like my favorite example of this is there's a big literature on how do we get teachers and incentivize teachers to teach better. And whether it's incentives or what's kind of different teaching techniques, that's kind of a nice experimental literature. But then you think about it and you go, wait, how did we pick the teachers that we are going to pick to be teachers? And that's a clear Yhat problem. And there's been a little bit of work done on that. There was a very nice project by Kane and Steger that tried to ask, oh, how would we select teachers? There have been more recent work in DC that tried to look at that. But teacher selection is just such a first order question. Police officer selection, any of these things. And so it's almost like buried inside every one of these arenas is some problem where we are making an implicit prediction about a person and on the basis of that prediction making a decision. And those implicit predictions are being made by a person. Everything in behavioral science tells us there's reasons to be skeptical that that person is doing as well with the data as one might be able to do. And so it kind of sets it up. I think that whole category is very promising, really, in most applications.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about this idea of explainable machine learning and explainability. And from what I understand, you seem to be saying we can make these accurate predictions with somewhat arbitrary gathering of variables or features, and it doesn't really matter what those are. But then I'm thinking in a medical situation, if you make a life or death decision based on the output of one of these things, and someone says, well, why did you predict that? Or, you know, like, so
Yeah.
I guess I'm interested in this relationship between an explanation, a prediction, and a cause.
Yeah.
And I know there's 2,000 years of philosophy around that, but I just wonder what your thoughts on that.
I guess I have a couple of thoughts. One is, I think that as with all of these things, these algorithms are actually going to reveal things not about algorithms, but about humans, things that we've known. So I think it's an entire optical illusion to think, oh, the doctor can explain their decision in a way the algorithm can't. The doctor can put out gibberish, which is what you tend to find, not because they're a doctor, just as that's what human beings are. There's a wonderful paper called Telling More Than We Know. I think that is probably one of the best under-read, highly cited papers in psychology. I think it has 20,000 cites and probably, I don't know. Have you read it, Stefano? I'm not going to put you on the spot. But it's not that well, but it's an amazingly good paper, and it's the beginning of a literature that really. I guess that's one, yeah, and they even go further and talk about, they ask people to articulate why they made the choices they did. Right. And what you find is that people have very little understanding of why they chose what they chose. And so I think the explainability question is really, I think, pushes us back to a much more basic question, which is what constitutes a reasonable explanation, and have we given empirical tests to the idea that when a human, a doctor, or a judge gives an explanation, are we just asking words come out? Because every time people have looked at it, there is not that much of a relationship between what people say they did, why they did what they did, and why they actually, what actually drove it. So I think that these will be problem. I think explainability will be a problem for humans as much as for algorithms. Yeah.
Boy, this is not usually a quiet crowd.
So I'm curious about the point you made about doctors being excessively regularized. It would apply to judges and hiring decisions too. And I guess the question is, like, to what extent is that like a constraint, like a cognitive constraint, or like a bug, or versus like something that's there by design, sort of more like a feature? And you could think of like maybe the depth 5 decision tree approximates the doctor's logic because that's what they read in their medical manual when they were going through training. And so I guess like more normatively, like, is there a vision for like re-educating using sort of optimal decision rules? Because you could think of a whole bunch of reasons why you might actually want to have a human in the loop aside from maximizing accuracy. Right. And just sort of to think of the like interaction between learning and teaching.
It's a great question. I think, I don't know what you thought, Zia, but I think until I saw these, people want there to be, oh, look, what if there's a identifiable subset of people the physicians are doing badly on? That's the easiest teaching case, because then you're like, hey, look, you should stop missing out on this group and this group and this group. This actually makes you not more pessimistic, but makes you kind of a little bit more like, oh, I see. What they're missing out on is a ton of distributed small signal all over the place. And it made me think that probably the kind of education or signal giving is going to have to happen in a different way in some form, and probably, I don't know if you think it's reasonable, but like, I think the easiest way to think about it is physicians are very used to working with tools that measure something and give back a score. There's no reason one can't take the neglected part and call that some sort of score, and the algorithm automatically generating that score, like a PSA test produces a score. Maybe that's the way around it. But I think these results made me think, wow, how are we going to your point about the psychology of it, this is a classic case of we're not very good at super complex models, and we just need a lot of complexity here. So it's not like I have an off-the-shelf solution. I'm not even sure what I would do. Yeah.
Hi. So the model for the heart attacks used the prior data for the patients, but the fact that there was a claim and they did come into the ER was also a data point. Is that model useful at all for predicting, or at least telling which patients should be more vigilant about the signs of heart attacks even if they didn't come into the ER?
Oh, I see. Oh, that's a really nice point. Just to make sure I understood it, you're asking the question, we're using this to help doctors make decisions. Why can't we use this to tell people, hey, you're at high risk, you should be more vigilant? That's a great question. Yeah, and you could imagine going much further, and if you're trying to design a personalized tool, using a lot more data and asking at what point. Because these are all the people who chose to show up at the ED. There's another undertesting problem, which is how many people are sitting at the right-hand side who said, oh, that's just abdominal pain, and didn't do anything. And we'd be like, no, when you have abdominal pain, you should show up. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Thanks for a great talk. So you're focusing here on why Yhat problems, right? On framing these in the context of prediction. And in this case, you still have a lot of degrees of freedom for how you define what the loss is that you're trying to optimize for. Mm-hmm. So here it seems like you're optimizing for either the accuracy of either being 0, 1 loss, or like the square difference between the predictions that you make and what the true Y was. It seems in this health context that there might be value in thinking about the different costs associated with making different kinds of errors. So maybe it could be the case that if you predict a patient has really low risk, but their true risk is really high, you should suffer more of a cost for that than if it was the other way around. Is there a way that you can think about these kind of cost-sensitive losses in this framework that's useful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in this and other work we've done, one of the things that we've tried to do the analysis without ever having to address those questions, and here's the sense in which the way we're doing it, we're simply trying to say misranking just means this was the sorted order of the algorithm, and you took this many people from down here and failed to take this many people from up here. So because it's always a human-to-machine comparison rather than a pure automation comparison, you can always just focus on just getting a ranking that's better. And so that allows us to sidestep. I think if we were doing automation of any kind, we'd have to really think about like, oh, how far and above and below the threshold people are. But here I think we've been able to sidestep that exactly because it's just and a lot of these Yhat problems in economics essentially boil down to a resource allocation problem and whether you've ranked appropriately for some resource allocation. So even when the resources are really important, oddly enough, it's just the ranking that ends up kind of being pertinent.
I'm curious whether there are specific recommendations with regards to how do you translate your results to actual medical practice. If there are, is it a matter of more widely pushing this risk metrics, or that in this case you look at just one very specific set of tests and outcomes? How generalizable is it across other types of risks? So yeah, how do we go from sort of a econometric machine learning analysis to actual changes in the hospitals?
Yeah, I think I see two paths. For me, the most compelling path that I saw here was actually not about the physician decisions, but about the fact that when we're trying to incentivize and try to drive test rates down, we're actually using too crude a proxy, because that's something that we can experiment with at the policy level. We can do policy level experiments where we say, let me change the incentives from try to reduce testing to let's reduce testing in this population, but induce testing in this population. And those are experiments that are easier to run. And they're the ones that I worry we've been making massive mistakes on. And maybe not. Maybe when we go do it, we'll find not really. But at the very least, I would say take a test, tried and tested technique, give incentives, people respond. Great. At the insurer level, let's give different incentives than just reducing testing. But at the doctor level, I think what I would say is with all of these things, like the work we've done on bail, like the work on this, I think that I view all of these as only proof of concept. There is just no way in archival data, I think it's at all credible to understand what a risk tool will do. So just to illustrate, it's entirely possible that when you put a risk tool out, a good risk tool that happens to be right, the problem gets worse. And the reason that would be plausible is when the risk tool goes with what they believe, the doctor does it. When it doesn't, they don't. And it further justifies some error and you magnify a mistake. Because we know the doctor is going to override, and without knowing where and what the distribution of override looks like, it's just not possible. So I think the next stage of this work is actually much, 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 much slower and laborious on that end, which is you have to pilot risk tools. You have to see what it does. You have to figure out which things are changed, run a big randomized control trial, or run a pilot and an RCT. I don't think there's a shortcut for that using just this data. I think if there's a pipeline, this is almost like the beginning of a pipeline. But the next parts of the pipeline are unlikely to use these tools.
All right, one last question.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting and inspiring. I guess I was really interested in what you talked about with the data that's missing or the people who don't show up. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we go about analyzing information about the data that we do have, but we don't have the information. So for instance, we know that there might be fundamental differences between people who come to the ER on Monday and people who wait until it's Friday and they have time off and they can come. Or there might be people who come on Friday but are told to come back on Monday because the doctor isn't here, for instance.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, at least if I were to summarize the credible inference approach to this, it would be to say, you first have to identify a reason that some people are being tested or not, like the weekend versus whatever. But then you have to establish that that reason isn't correlated with a bunch of other things. And here, I didn't get to do it, but I think we tried our best, but you're never quite sure because you don't have a true experiment. So I agree with that. But I think the spirit of it does run very much in a way that's inconsistent with a typical sort of ML approach, which is, oh, let's just use all the data we can and do what we can. It requires domain knowledge in a fundamentally different way than setting up the Y variable or the X variable. It involves domain knowledge to say, where might there be plausible exogenous variation in labels? Is it actually exogenous? Now let's look at the observables. Like, let's form Y hats and see if they differ and the distributions differ. It's just a very different kind of work. And so, yeah, I agree with, I think you're right. I think that's exactly the kind of thing one would need to do a ton more. But why it's so hard is I think you have to develop a sense of all the data that's completely not in your data frame. So it's not an exercise of that. It's so domain specific because you have to have an enormous sense of, wow, there's a bunch of stuff that's not recorded. So, all right.
Great. Well, listen, why don't you join me in thanking Sendhil?